Good morning, everyone. I'm Mark Wallace. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of United Against Nuclear Iran. Without further ado, let's get right into this because the issues of the day are bigger than any very long introductions. I would just want to acknowledge the incredibly distinguished panel we have on the guest. Obviously, Senator Graham is an old friend. Senator, we got to know each other when it was the Three Amigos, and I know that Senators McCain and Lieberman would be so happy that you're leading the charge on this and you're continuing to do that. And we're here today because you're the only voice up here that's called for action against the people behind this. And that really is to your credit. We'll talk about that more. Kazar Arabi is a colleague of mine at United Against Nuclear Iran, formerly at the Tony Blair Institute, and I think one of the world's leading scholars on the IRGC. Jason Brodsky is the policy director of United Against Nuclear Iran and is a force of nature and probably one of the most respected policy experts on the subject and is renowned across the interwebs, as they say. Norm Rule, who's sitting next to Senator Graham, I don't think I can actually introduce you because I think half of it would be classified, Norman, of course, but Norman is probably the leading voice over the last, if I say the true number of years, Norm, it would indicate that you're really older than you should be, but really the leading voice in the intelligence community on Iran, and also an advisor and a colleague of mine at United Against Nuclear Iran. And on the end of the table, not for any reason, just because we couldn't have a big enough round table, is Gabriel Noronha, who is formerly in the United States government, worked on the Iran Action Group, and was a very key player in helping to isolate the Iranian regime, and has become a force of nature in isolating the regime. Let's get right into it. And Senator, I want to obviously throw it to you, but what I'd like to ask, because we have a short period of time, is how can it be that right now there is debate that it is Iran behind these actions that we see going across the Middle East? And we were talking on the phone about this. Senator Lieberman and I put out a statement calling for action against the IRGC, not the Iran, but the IRGC, who oppresses its own people and is responsible for these attacks. The only echoing statement of that was by, and you did it before us, was you, Senator Graham. And so President Biden right now is in the Middle East, and he has shown a great show of support for Israel. We appreciate that and for the action there. But the glaring omission of the word Iran still sticks out. And I worry that that lack of moral clarity about who's truly behind this makes the world a more dangerous place. And Senator, you've been the leader in this issue. So why is there that lack of moral clarity?
That's a good question. How does this thing work? Dead?
It's on,
Yeah.
It's on? Can you hear me? Okay. War fatigue. They give wars numbers for a reason. We tend to make the same mistakes over and over again. So how do you explain that we're talking about Iran, the great Satan, and like nobody's here? You got a few cameras that are streaming, but people will look back at this and say, should have paid attention. The goal is to tell the truth as we see it.
Yeah.
And if you believe the Ayatollah in Iran woke up one day and read about this attack in the paper or saw it on TV, you're crazy. I don't know how the Ayatollah's day starts. Maybe he has like an Ayatollah briefing. What's going on today? Well, Hamas just invaded Israel. Boy, that's very interesting. Do you think that is remotely possible? No, that's just all bullshit. So why don't we talk about it more? Because you'd have to act. In World War I, everybody put on nice uniforms, jacked up about going to war, thought they'd be home in 3 or 4 months. 4 years later, you have a whole generation of young men throughout Europe wiped out and a bunch of people killed, right? World War II rolls around. What drove the appeasement of Hitler? The memories of World War I were so awful. People want to believe that the terrorist is not a terrorist because you have to deal with him. People wanted to believe that Hitler was just joking when he said he wrote his book. We live in a time where that if you had to tell the truth about Iran, the likelihood of acting goes up. I think that's what's driving this. Republicans are beating on Biden for the hostages and everything else, and they should be. But I don't have a big crowd behind me saying we should put Iran on notice. We're going to attack them militarily if this war expands. They killed 30 Americans. So the Republican Party beats on Biden about his Iran policy, but here's the question for this group. I'm trying to restore lost deterrence. Whether you like Trump or not, the Iranians were afraid of him. Everybody was afraid of him because he seemed to have a different way of doing business that was at times confusing, but people felt afraid. The President of the United States flies to the Mideast, and Jordan, Egypt, and Abbas won't even meet with him based on a BS report about Israel hitting a hospital. Every media outlet in the world took Hamas's version and ran with it. And they canceled the meeting of the President of the United States, who is actually trying to help the Palestinians. This is not good. So I don't want to talk much longer, but the reason we're not doing more to hold Iran accountable is we'll have to act. I am telling everybody in the Republican conference and all of my Democratic friends, if this war expands, if Hezbollah comes after Iran in Israel in any serious way, then I will be urging action militarily against Iran. They've killed 30 Americans. They'd be alive today without the Iranians, helping Hamas to take down the oil infrastructure. They'll have no money for terrorism. And if they want a war with the United States, we will win it. To all of you here, thank you for not letting us look away. You remind us of who Iran is. You see these things over here? What does Iran really want? Well, if you got a ballistic missile with death to Israel on the side of it, that's not reassuring to Israel. I mean, Hamas wants to kill all the Jews and establish some kind of caliphate. Iran wants to dominate the Islamic faith, destroy the Jewish state, eventually come after us. Israel can't afford 2 Holocausts. One was enough. And they're going to have to act. And I'm trying to get the American public and political system to come to grips that this terrorist regime that's got blood on its hands for decades against our country is now a time of reckoning. It is time to call the question on Iran.
One follow-up, Senator, and then maybe we could go to Norm. And maybe it's an obvious question, but I think we should discuss it. How dangerous does it make it that we don't say the word Iran and we don't deter them when they organize the massacre of babies, children, women, and the elderly in a brutal manner that harkens back to ISIS? In any other context, we would hunt down the leaders of these groups, bring them to justice. But right now, Iran is sitting back, knowing that they were behind that, and not facing any consequences. That clearly emboldens them, but that makes the world a much more dangerous place. How are we ignoring that, and how do we address that, and how does the Congress address that, Senator?
So I've got a resolution I'm trying to get together to hopefully find a Democratic colleague that will say escalation against Israel means an attack on Iran. Why did they do it now, and why was it so vicious? I am 1,000% convinced that Iran is threatened deeply by the reconciliation prospects between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Why now? I've been one of the leading voices in both parties about expand the Abraham Accords. The next logical step is normalization with Saudi and Israel. I went back to Saudi Arabia after promising never to go because of the Khashoggi deal to reestablish a relationship that can be beneficial to the world. Saudi Arabia is changing. They're moving in the right direction. This attack was so vicious and so cruel that it had a purpose. I mean, Hamas doesn't need a reason to be cruel. They're just cruel, but it had a purpose. Here's the purpose: to make it so gruesome that Israel could not look away. They have to go in on the ground. And the belief is that will stop the reconciliation process, that Israel can't make war and peace at the same time, that the whole world will get distracted and the normalization efforts will die. I am going to the region here soon. I'm going to Saudi Arabia, I'm going to Israel, I'm going to go to Egypt. My goal is to make sure Iran doesn't fails in their effort to destroy the normalization process. So what can Congress do? We can unequivocally have Israel's back. We can say we support the destruction of Hamas. That's non-negotiable, but what is negotiable is how we do it. I'd like to lessen the loss of innocent lives, but I want all of us during this very perilous time to not give up on the effort to end the Arab-Israeli conflict. You're against a nuclear-armed Iran. Good. If they had a nuke, would they use it? Yes. Rocket Man wants nukes as an insurance policy to keep his thuggish state, right? China's got a nuclear force to be a world power, so does Russia. I don't believe that these three actors I just named are going to attack us preemptively. They're not religious zealots. They have their own agendas. The Iranians are motivated by religion. They want chaos to bring back the missing imam. They want the end times to unfold in their lifetime. So if they had a nuclear weapon, I am 100% confident they would use it as part of their religious crusade, endeavors against Israel and to accelerate the return of the missing imam. That may sound crazy to you, but they say it all the time. Hitler wrote a book, nobody believed him. Look what these people do routinely. So your voice is very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Norma, I want to chat with you, if I could, a little bit about deterrence. We've had how many calls at ridiculous hours of the day and night about the intel community concerned about deterrence. I was struck that the same people that are providing weapons and killing innocent Ukrainians, the same people that are killing Jews, the same people that are running around London targeting Kasra and other people, the same people that are running around the United States targeting Americans are all the IRGC. When we called for military action against IRGC targets, we made it very clear. The people that reached out to me first were the Iranian people that I know, the Iranian diaspora, because they knew that we weren't seeking to target Iranians, but this regime. Norm, we've talked so much about that level of deterrence and how there's concern across intel communities around the world that the failure to be transparent and open about the Iranian role in these matters only emboldens them and makes them greater. What do we do to bring deterrence back? And other than talking about this, tell me your views about what Iran's role in this attack, and could it have happened without Iran?
Thank you, Mark, and good morning. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank you for superb questions and the support you provide on the Iran issue. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel, and it's wonderful to hear the wisdom of the good senator. You strike at the heart of the issue. In a few days, we will observe the 40th anniversary of the bombing in Beirut that took 241 American lives. We've had Iran send weapons to Iraq that killed hundreds of Americans. We have Iran sending drones to Ukraine, killing innocents. We now have Iran instigating a conflagration that will kill thousands, as well as targeting Americans in the United States, in the homeland of the United States. It is impossible to say that we have a successful deterrence posture against the individuals behind these actions. And whatever your views are on the politics of the situation, the existing level of sanctions, the existing level of diplomacy is not deterring these people from conducting operations that are now resulting in thousands of dead civilians, to include 30 Americans. But here's the danger. It's not just the danger. Here's how it gets worse. If, as bad as it has been, this is a virtual guarantee that it will continue. So the harsh reality is you have to wonder who is listening to this presentation today that may be dead in the coming year because of a Quds Force operation that was not deterred because sanctions against people who have no assets in the United States, do not use international financial systems, do not travel, and the regime doesn't want them to travel, are not just symbolic, but they actually encourage the adversary to say, this is all they're going to do. In essence, what we have done over the years is, for a variety of reasons, particularly since engagement became a dominant aspect of American foreign policy and sanctions relief accompanying that engagement, we have kicked a can down the road. and that can has gotten heavier with every kick and the road shorter. And in Gaza, we've come to the cul-de-sac with a 55-gallon drum can of terror. So I think you've got the right point. We do not want to raise Iran in many conversations for reasons that Ray's, as the good senator has stated, we have to do something about it. But from Ukraine to Gaza, from Washington to New York, from Beirut to Yemen and Africa, people are dying and will die unless this posture changes.
The senator mentioned if they had a nuclear weapon, they would use it. If you're willing to slaughter children and do what we've seen, you're willing to use a nuclear weapon, in my opinion. Norm, we frequently, I don't want to say who said it to us, but a diplomat that we know from the region and multiple others said, you know, if they're going to continue to do this and there has to be repercussions, shouldn't we do this before they get a nuclear weapon? And I think that that's been it rings in our conversations, Norm. We talk in too many and at an inappropriate amount of time. But speak to that, because I don't think it's just an opinion shared by us. It's an opinion shared around the region, but our friends and diplomats in other countries are scared a bit to disrupt the President Biden's kick the can down the road approach, which we all disagree with, while at the same time I want to be very respectful. He is offshore, he is in Israel showing support to our ally, and he is my president right now. So I want to be very respectful to him and his team. But I worry that that statement reflects a belief in a lack of American seriousness. Can you speak to that? Because you've heard that more than anybody I know in the world. I've heard it a lot, but I know you've heard it from many people in the region.
I have indeed, and it raises the broader question of every time Iran develops a capability or is involved in a conflict where American warfighters or civilians are present, it actually has constrained some policymaker decision-making, and the region has noticed this. And that fragments our coalitions, our alliances. It reduces the impact of sanctions. And what it does is it tells the region, if the West, and this isn't just the United States, these are our good friends in Europe and in Asia. If the West or the international community is unwilling to confront Iran at present, would they be willing to confront Iran with a nuclear weapon? And that sense of doubt can only be overcome by a sense of realistic deterrence. Diplomacy is absolutely the way we should pursue this. Relentless diplomacy is a brilliant approach, but endless diplomacy without deterrence is a gift to Tehran. And at present, it's difficult to identify the deterrence that we have set against an adversary. That tomorrow, if we received a report that instead of Hamas, ISIS-like militants, terrorists killing people in Israel, if we received a report, Senator, saying that 20 ISIS militants from Hamas came across the southern border of the United States and attacked Jewish facilities in America, would you be surprised? And would we say that we had set a deterrence to Iran against that? And the answer is we didn't. And we should expect more and worse things to happen that just erode that sense in the world that, you know, they're just not willing to take Iran on. And if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, they'll really not be willing to take Iran on.
Thanks, Norman. It really is a deep view, in my opinion, shared across a vast portion of our intelligence community. We obviously can't go into that, but I think that lack of deterrence is a key thing.
Mark, can I just inject one more comment?
Please.
Sanctions enforcement is critical to an international sense of our willingness to deter Iran. And if you look at oil sales to China, that has built up a reserve in Iran that will be very difficult and time-consuming to gnaw down under actual serious sanctions. And not playing to the audience, the most significant oil sanction against Iran would not have come about without United Against Nuclear Iran and your personal leadership in the last year, and it's difficult to actually identify a significant oil sanction on Iran outside of that in recent memory. And our allies have noticed that.
I appreciate that, Norman. You know, as we seized a supertanker with the United States Department of Justice, who I really want to applaud, it was about $100 million. I do note that only a few days after that Justice Department revelation, we did agree to give over $6 billion to the Iranians as part of it. So it seemed to be a bit of a drop in the barrel. All the while, 300 other vessels are on the seas right now transporting oil. Jason, I'd like to go to you because you have an incredible sense of this. What does it do to allies in the region when we see that we won't act? I want to remind everyone that it was President Obama that took the very courageous action. Didn't seem that it was that courageous at the time, but maybe in this political context it was, to literally invade Pakistan to kill Osama bin Laden and to take action to kill the worst of the worst terrorists wherever they may be, including in countries that we had diplomatic relations to. That ethos seems to have disappeared. Can you put that in the context now and the allergy of speaking to Iran and the disconnect with that has caused, even from policies of Democratic and Republican presidents in recent memory? How is that so different now? And what has that done to form what I call a new axis of terror?
Thank you, and it's great to be with you. I do think it erodes our deterrence significantly. It strains our partnerships, which are absolutely vital. And I know that the Biden administration has made a point of strengthening our alliances and partnerships around the world, and that is absolutely critical. But it can't just be in Europe. It has to be in the Middle East as well. And that strains the perception of our partners in the Middle East. I would say that I would agree with Senator Graham that if the United States is apparently seeking to keep Iran's role undefined, because if it comes out and says that Iran was directly involved, that's going to put public pressure on the administration to then do something about it. And it's apparent not only to Americans, but it's also apparent to the Iranian regime that he is not keen on doing something about the Iranian problem. And that causes a perception problem, because the Islamic Republic knows we have the capability to inflict grievous losses on their military and security apparatus, but it doubts that we have the will to do so. And unless and until we change that latter calculus, escalation is inevitable. I think there's also a very interesting asymmetry in the Iranian rhetoric and the American rhetoric in the aftermath of this awful slaughter by Hamas terrorists against Israel, and that the Iranian leadership has no problem, if you monitor their statements in recent days, saying that the United States will be held responsible for Israel's actions in Gaza. But the United States, on the other hand, sends a de-escalatory message in public to the Iranian regime, and that creates a risk of a miscalculation on the part of Tehran that they can get away with more than they can, and that can actually make a war more likely, not less likely. So I think that we need to all figure this into our deterrence posture. And then last and certainly not least, Mark, I would just like to mention the transnational repression that's been going on here on U.S. soil and on European soil. Look, if looking at our allies and partners' perception of our readiness to defend our interests, if we do not hold the Islamic Republic of Iran accountable for an attempted assassination or an attempted kidnapping on U.S. soil, this is a hostile foreign power challenging the United States on American soil, then how can we be expected to come to their defense during their time of need? So it strains our partnerships, it strains our alliances, and we can't just create deterrence by issuing a strongly worded press statement warning of unspecified consequences should the Iranians continue these attempts on American and European soil. We can't restore deterrence with piecemeal sanctions with individuals who have no assets in the United States and are unlikely to travel here. And we can't restore deterrence with just an indictment of individuals who likely, again, won't step foot in the United States. There has to be a kinetic element to these policies to change the Iranian perception.
Gabriel, I was going to throw to you, but with your permission, I'm going to go to Kazra instead. I really wanted to go to you next because Jason talked about transnational repression, and we have Kazra, our colleague from the United Kingdom here, who has been a target of that transnational repression and is an expert on the IRGC and experiences that. I was struck by the statements of Tom Tugendhat previously and the head of MI6, who recently said the biggest threat on UK soil, let me repeat that, the biggest threat on UK soil is the danger of Iranian terror against its citizens. That's an extraordinary statement. Right now, that same threat's experienced by Americans, including Americans in this room, I might add, in the United States on U.S. soil. Kasra, can you speak to that a little bit and with your expertise on the IRGC? And what's it like to be a Briton when you hear the British government say the biggest danger is elements of Iranian agents trying to kill diaspora members, including you?
Yes, thank you, Mark, and thank you for the Senator for hosting this very timely session. On the transnational repression, well, the fact that as a British citizen I don't feel safe in London is, quite frankly, ridiculous, absurd, and it's indicative of the failed policy towards the Islamic Republic of Iran. The UK, we have showed on multiple occasions that the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, is active on British soil. Just before I joined UANI, I exposed an IRGC cell in London where British Muslim students, as part of the Islamic Student Association of Britain and Europe, an entity, by the way, that is controlled by the Beit Rahbari, the Supreme Leader's office, that has an office in London, in Hammersmith, was hosting online senior IRGC commanders, not just any senior IRGC commanders, the most violent and extremist IRGC commanders, Saeed Qasemi, who on record previously had said that during the 1990s, he had trained Al-Qaeda. The IRGC had trained Al-Qaeda. These IRGC commanders not only glorified IRGC terrorism to British Muslim students, not only propagated extreme anti-Semitism, but they called on these students in London to join an apocalyptic army to, quote, end the lives of Jews around the world. We exposed this, and the Home Secretary rightly said, with this new evidence, we can clearly state that the IRGC is the biggest threat to British national security. Despite this evidence, despite the IRGC's persistent efforts, not only to target British citizens directly, but also to nurture homegrown Islamist radicalization and terrorism using methods like ISIS Al-Qaeda through their centers, despite this, the IRGC has still not been prescribed. So what we're in a situation where the IRGC is using methods like ISIS, like Al-Qaeda, but for ISIS and Al-Qaeda, the sanctions regime in place, because they are prescribed entities, prohibits any form of activity relating to these terrorist organizations. But today, in London, the IRGC's activities, such as propaganda activities, such as its efforts to radicalize and call for terrorism, are not prohibited. The IRGC needs to be prescribed as a terrorist organization. There's no doubt about that. That's the least, by the way, that the Europeans can do. And to do that, if I may, and I don't want to get into the bipartisan politics of the US because I'm not a US citizen, we need, I say we, the Europeans, US support. We need a US push. We need congressional support. We need support from the Senate. The US needs to push the Europeans and the Brits to prescribe the IRGC as the very least mechanism to impose consequences on Tehran, because there needs to be much more than this, not least targeting IRGC assets in the region, but also in Iran. And let me make it very clear, as an Iranian diaspora member, targeting IRGC bases is not targeting the Iranian people. It is not an attack on Iran. It is targeting the very people who terrorize the people of Iran, the very people who killed Mahsa, Nika, Mohammad Reza. The Iranian people share a common enemy with the Israeli people. The Iranian people stand with the Israeli people because the force that is terrorizing the people of Israel is the same force that is terrorizing the people of Iran.
They're the same victims. We see it, and I was amazed. We obviously have a lot of friends in the Iranian diaspora community, I was amazed at the outpouring of support when we said, let's go straight at these IRGC facilities.
Absolutely.
Gabe, I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot because you might be unanswerable. But you know, there was some polling data recently on CNN that showed the lack of support for Israel amongst young people in the Democratic Party and otherwise. But I'm also surprised at the lack of clarity on the Iran issue in a bipartisan way. This is an incredible group that I'm proud to stand with, and Senator Graham's leadership has been truly wonderful. He's my friend, so you should take it with a little grain of salt, but not too much. But he's truly been a leader in this space. How is it possible that it's so lonely up here and there's bipartisan neglect? You were in the government before, and you speak to a lot of folks on the right as well. It's as if no one's paying attention. How do you explain that, if you can?
So here's what I would first say. Senator Graham warned that if we withdrew from Afghanistan, the Taliban would take over, and they did. Senator Graham warned that if we didn't provide weapons to Ukraine, and that if we didn't sanction Nord Stream 2, that Russia would invade, and they did. Senator Graham is warning now that because we refuse to enforce sanctions on Iran, that we are headed towards a disaster, and we are. Senator Graham and all of us here have warned that if we paid $6 billion in ransom payment to Iran, that Iran and its proxies would take more hostages around the region, and they have now taken hundreds. It's time for the press, it's time for the American public and Congress to start paying attention to our warnings. There's a track record of a deterioration of American security. There's a track record of Israel's security and Americans around the region being put at risk. Here's some stats which the American public, Democrat or Republican, should just look at and make up their own minds. Since the Biden administration took office, there have been 83 attacks, at least, against Americans in the region. America responded 4 times. Only once even killed Iranian proxies. That's a recipe for disaster. In 2017, Iran was giving Hamas $100 million a year. After we reimposed maximum pressure, Hamas went on an austerity plan. Today, it is getting $350 million from Iran. That is 93% of its budget. If we don't think that Iran is responsible when they fund 93% of someone's budget, people are misleaded. So I think what the public needs to do, this has been a wake-up call. This has happened in Israel. There are at least a dozen Americans, including many of my former bosses, including Secretary Pompeo, including John Bolton, who are under assassination threat here on American soil. They've been under assassination threat for 3 years. We cannot let the smoking gun be a dead senior American official or human rights dissident. We are warning, this whole panel is warning, this is what's coming down the table, and the Iranian regime does not care if you are a Democrat or if you are a Republican. The Iranian regime does not care whether you support, whether you're going to vote for President Biden. They do not care whether you are of Iranian descent, of American descent. They see their enemies and they want to kill them. So here's the solution that we are saying. We need to enforce our oil sanctions. Right now, Iran gets $150 million a day, at least, in its oil export revenue. That needs to go down as close to zero as we possibly can. That will dry up the money for terrorism. And we have to tell Iran, if you kill Americans, there are consequences. Right now, Iran does not believe there are consequences because at least 30 Americans are dead and no Iranians are dead. As a result, there has been no response. Iran has gotten away with it. They believe, rightly, that they can because there's been no response. There have been no missiles from the United States against Hamas. There have been no U.S. missiles against the Iranian installations that train Hamas fighters. And there have been no attacks against Iran's oil infrastructure, which funds all these attacks. If we continue the status quo, things will get worse. So it's time for Republicans and Democrats to work together and create firm accountability for Iran. And that includes an AUMF from Congress, authorizing the president to take action, and that requires Congress to pass laws. Congress can't keep sitting on its hands here. And thank you, Senator Graham, and thank you, Ioanni, for your leadership here.
Thank you, Gabe. Just one quick follow-up. When you were on the Iran Action Group, Iranian oil sales fell to under 400,000 barrels a day, around 300,000 and change. Right now, there are approximately 2.4 million barrels a day of Iranian oil. That is a lot of money that is empowering Iran's behavior. You remember that.
What we saw in 2019 when we put our oil sanctions on, we saw Syrian fighters complain to the New York Times that the golden days were gone, that they had been laid off from work, that they'd been laying off their reserves, their benefits were being cut, their salaries were being cut. Hamas went on austerity, Iraqi militias were getting laid off. That and Iran's IRGC budget was cut 28% in just 1 year. In the last 2 years, we've seen the complete reversal of all those trends. We are seeing the oil sales fund all these terror groups. They are providing the financial support for Hamas to survive, for Hezbollah to build up its missile arsenal to potentially kill more Americans and thousands of Israelis. And they're providing a lifeline up for the regime that was on the verge of collapse, we think. And at the end of 2020, the regime was on the verge of collapse. The Iranian people want to overthrow their government. There will not be, there do not have to be U.S. tanks rolling through Tehran. The Iranian people want to do this work themselves. No one is calling for that. We are saying we put pressure on the regime, and the Iranian people will do the rest.
Thanks, Gabe. Senator, people remember, but you've been doing great work up here for so long, that you're a lawyer by training and you're a former military lawyer by training. And we both been around this long enough to remember the doctrine of preemption that we had when we had faced our threats. And I don't want to have I think you and I would probably subscribe to that because we know where we stand. And I understand that people might not have liked that. But right now, I would say we no longer have a doctrine of preemption. We have a doctrine you really have to sacrifice a lot of souls before you're going to get us to act. And it would appear to me, and I don't want to be glib about this, but I don't know how to put this delicately. It would seem that our posture is a certain number of Hezbollah rockets must rain down on Israel and Tel Aviv before the great fighting force on the Gerald R. Ford carrier group, the Eisenhower battle group, and the Bataan will interact. So that's a doctrine of sacrifice. Mm-hmm. So I'm trying not to be glib, but how many rockets will it take to hit Tel Aviv before we act? And in some ways, the doctrine of preemption is already over because they've already attacked. This attack by Hamas was already that Iranian attack. So I don't know what to call it, Senator. You're better at this than all of us combined. Yeah. What is the doctrine of that we must suffer before we act? And how do we reverse that?
I think it's the doctrine of the 30s. If you thought the 1930s were a great foreign policy period, you were wrong. So why, if you'd had this meeting in 1938 talking about Hitler, you'd have the same crowd we have here today. What we're trying to say is that Israel will preempt if they have to. The Iranians believe that Israel would attack if they had to. The Iranians believe they can survive an attack by Israel against their nation. That the Arab world would be sympathetic to the idea that Iran was a victim of the Jewish state. The Iranians know that they cannot survive a war with us. The doctrine in place now is not preemption, as you said, Mr. Ambassador. It is, if you do any more, we're going to come after you. Why am I talking about military force as the response if the war expands? I think that's the only spot that politically will work now. If it were up to me, we'd have had an authorization to use force against Iran a long time ago. Number two, the president doesn't need an AUMF. He has all the authority as Article II Commander-in-Chief to do whatever he needs to do to protect Americans at home and abroad. All of you eloquently have put out the notion that the IRGC and other Iranian entities have been killing us for a long time, and we've responded very poorly. Why am I talking about future escalation? Why am I buying into the idea a bunch more rockets have to be released, because politically I don't think I can do any better.
I mean, I was trying not to be glib, but I believe that there has to be some number of rockets before we attack, and that means a loss of life and suffering, and that is an incredible opposite of deterrence and a tragedy.
So, Matt, I'm trying to define what escalation looks like. We're in a heated contest for escalation dominance. What's going on right now? Hezbollah issued a statement yesterday. You know, we've had it. Iran said time is out today. The Iranians are threatening the Israelis with further action if they go in on the ground in a meaningful way. Hezbollah is threatening action against Iran if they go into the ground in a meaningful way against Israel. Our bases in Iraq are being threatened by Shiite militias. What is our response? Don't. Okay? That's not my response. My response is, if you do open up a second front, there will be a third front. There's going to be one front or three fronts. There are not going to be two. So if you accelerate the attacks in the north, where there are 100,000 rockets that could do a lot of damage to Israel, I will be driving hard to push the Biden administration and the Western world to take the regime down their oil revenue and hit their IRGC targets. I don't know how many rockets that is. So we're in a game here between when's enough for the Congress, and here's what I worry about. I don't know if there is enough. We're so reluctant to get involved in conflict that we're creating more of it.
This is exciting.
And this is this is the 21-year period between World War I and World War II. I was at lunch. Tom Cott's been great. Everybody wants to take their money away. Everybody wants to, freeze the assets. That's not going to change the game. For all the reasons you said, they don't need a lot of money. It's not like they want to go on a world tour and they can't go now. These people are on a mission, and it's not to travel, it's to kill, and it's to dominate. So I'm trying to set the conditions that would be most favorable to a vote about hitting Iran if they do too much. We should be already telling Iran, you're now a target based on what you've done. But we don't have that luxury. So help me define what escalation looks like. I'll end with this. Today, under the Iran nuclear agreement, the restriction on ballistic missile development by the Iranians expired. Today. So was that a good deal? Hell no. Look at that missile, death to Israel on it. Under the deal, they're free to do anything they want to do now. So here's what I'm going to tell my colleagues later in the day. Get ready to be asked questions about what Senator Graham is proposing.
Thank you, Senator. Do we think that if Hezbollah, that number of missiles that need to rain down, strikes, is the United States only going to limit its response to Hezbollah and its proxies? Because we keep not saying the Iran word, so it's not even a question of how many missiles on Tel Aviv, but will we be responding against the ultimate target?
Well, here's the question. If Israel had to attack tomorrow because they saw something that unnerved them in Iran, would we go behind them? I think there's a general belief Trump will, like Trump or don't like Trump, none of this would be happening with Trump. I mean, that's just a fact, I think. It doesn't mean he's right about everything. It's just we've lost deterrence is what we're all saying here. And I want to support President Biden as much as you can. You only have one president at a time and trying to rally around the flag here. But at the end of the day, don't is not working. And to my Republican colleagues, you got to do more than beat Biden up about all of his impeachment. You have to embrace the idea you, as a Republican, we as a party, are calling for action against Iran. And if the Republican Party can't do that, that's a damning indictment of where we've come as a party. The party of Ronald Reagan would have no problem with what I'm saying. Have you seen any prominent Republican, Cotton, me, and a few others, really pushing the idea enough already with Iran? No. So I don't know, Matt, how many rockets have to come, but it appears that there are going to have to be more. If Israel goes in, I hope we'll go behind them. And if Iran believes all that, this war won't escalate. If Iran believed that they would be a target based on expansion in the north, they'd be less likely to be an expansion in the north. Clearly, they don't believe that.
Thank you, Senator. There's clearly has to be, and I think you and I are expressing the same shock in a different way. There has to be some sort of unifying statement, legislative vehicle. Whether it was an AUMF or not, I agree with your legal interpretation, of course, that the president does need an AUMF. But where is the legislative unity, Republican and Democrat, saying we will not stand?
It's here. I'm a caucus of one. I'm the only guy.
You are a caucus of one.
McCall mentioned this. There's some Democrats that are actually talking to me about a sense that the Senate resolution that would define what an escalation would be and that they would support a military response against Iran. There are a few that are actually reaching out to me, but I am stunned after this horrific attack on our best ally. 30 of our own citizens have been killed, a dozen in captivity at the hands of the Iranians, and we have been so tepid, to say beyond don't. And, you know, you can beat Biden up, he deserves it, but where are we as Republicans? That's what bothers me the most right now, is I am trying to rally the... I can imagine how Churchill must have felt back in the late 30s. So I saw a show last night about, couldn't sleep, Hitler and the Nazis, and one whole episode was about how the German high command was ready to take Hitler out in 1939 or 40. And peace in our time happened like 2 weeks before the plan was supposed to unfold. And Hitler got the Sudetenland without firing a shot, and that broke up that effort. There were about 3 occasions where weakness by the Western world gave Hitler a pass. And you talk about, Gabe, the Iranian people want a better life. They certainly do. So I just don't want to be seen in history as that guy. I don't want to be seen in history as the guy that made it easy to kill more, not harder to kill more, that incentivized terrorism instead of stop it. Here's the lesson from World War II. When you see evil, confront it.
Norm, I want to talk to you because we've talked about it in private. It seems like we've talked about all these issues in private, and we should do them in as much as we can in public as well. Let's talk about the force deployment right now, where you have the Ford and its battle group, you have the Eisenhower battle group, and you have the baton moving, and the sort of vague calls that we've seen publicly about the call-up of other Marine forces. What is the significance of the call-up of those assets? What is the message it's sending? And tell us a little bit about your views about positioning, whether it be from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, and how that affects force effectiveness.
Thank you, Mark. And to add to your previous question, the Senator's wise answer, it comes back to the question of, do these represent a deterrence? As Jason correctly stated, there's no question in the Iranian mind that they know our military is capable of annihilating their military. There's no question that they recognize that we have assets in the region that are able to do terrific devastation at really any time. The question comes down to, will we use these assets? The Gerald Ford is the most modern aircraft carrier we have, the largest in the world, and the Dwight Eisenhower, built in 1997, is very modernized. They've got multiple missile vessels coming with them. But if you're Iran, what is the red line that says the United States will use these assets against Iran? If this group turned around to a cell that said, we're going to pretend we're Iranians right now, we're in the Islamic Republic, and we're going to say, okay, what's the red line we can't cross? We can go up to this with the United States. I think we'd have some difficulty with that. threatening Americans in the U.S., in the capital of the homeland, in a post-9/11 world, killing thousands of people abroad, drones to Ukraine. I'm sort of running out of hundreds of missiles against Saudi Arabia, where there are thousands of Americans, and missiles don't turn left and right over the head of a blue passport. The significance of this force group is we have the power to significantly punish Iran and its allies, but that power will not be conveyed if they believe we don't have the will to do so. So our political dynamic, and I make no comment on that because that's my old world has trained me that way, it shapes their perception. So I think you asked a great question. You gave a great answer, and I think it fits into that.
Thank you, Norm. Jason, I want to talk about, if we could, I know we're running out of time because Senator has some legislative duties coming up shortly, the alliance, the axis that's formed here. Right now, if we knew where bin Laden was, if it was Tora Bora or wherever it was, we would go get him. And we're seeing, because I think of a lack of deterrence, an alliance of countries that are forming against us, that's including these proxies. Talk to us a little. We were talking before this about the designation that took place today, and it showed an incredible alliance that you and I have talked a lot about between financing Iran, Hamas, and Qatar. Can you talk to that and explain to me how a major non-NATO U.S. ally is partnering with Iran, kissing the cheek of the Iranian foreign minister while holding the leaders that directed these attacks and not turning them over to U.S. authorities?
Yes, it's very troubling. In today's sanctions designation announcement against around 10 leaders of Hamas, there was one particular designation that stood out, and that was of a man who's based in Qatar who has deep connections to the Iranian regime. And I think that our major non-NATO ally, Qatar, has for far too long provided a permissive environment and funding in many respects to the Hamas leadership and also support to the Islamic Republic. Let's not forget, it was last year that at a defense expo in Qatar, they hosted an IRGC naval commander, Ali Reza Tangsiri, who is the commander of the IRGC, a sworn enemy of the United States. There was also pictures of the emir meeting with Mohsen Rezai, who is under an arrest warrant for his role in the bombing of the Amia Jewish Community Center in 1994. That should not be how a non-NATO major U.S. ally works. And there have to be consequences. It cannot be business as usual. So I do think more attention has to be devoted to this support network, and I think that the Treasury Department announcement is a step in that direction. It's certainly not sufficient, but it's necessary.
That's fine. But right now, the bin Ladens of this story are sitting in an office tower in Doha, Qatar with the support of the Iranian government. Is there anybody in this room that doesn't want those guys turned over to the United States of America right now? Is there any doubt from anybody in this room that if it was bin Laden, that we wouldn't run airstrikes on our major non-U.S. ally? Is there anybody here that does not say that the Qataris should not be turning over these bastards to us and cease their involvement with Iran? Anybody? Audience? Anyone? Sorry to do the Ferris Bueller line on a very serious matter, but that is unacceptable. Senator, I know you agree with that.
Yeah, just think about it this way. You know, we have thousands of troops stationed in Qatar, right? They were very helpful to us in Afghanistan getting people out. So they are an ally, but this is a moment to draw. You know, what is the red line? I'm going to ask that today when I meet with the administration. If you don't have one, you need to get one. You need to communicate to us what it is and tell the Iranians. And not having one is unacceptable. So I'm going to take your idea and run with it. As to the Qataris, you need to close Hamas's office.
And turn them over to the U.S. authorities. Norm and I were talking about this before. I don't want to see Ismail Haniyeh and Khalid Michel disappear into the ether. We would have never allowed that in the context of bin Laden. It is the worst crime of crimes. We regret Tora Bora. Tora Bora right now is an office tower with the largesse of the Iranians and the Qataris in Doha. Turn them over to us, at least maybe, and I don't believe in trading for hostages, but at least we would have some leverage if we had these guys.
I got to run. Thank you for the work you've done, Gabe. That was great. He's with Polaris. We're trying to create, politically, I'll just be a little, the Republican Party has groups organized for the pro-life movement, for Second Amendment rights, the Club for Growth, the Business Roundtable. There are all kind of groups out there that intervene with Republicans about domestic policy. There is no real voice now educating members about why it's bad for Iran to get a nuclear weapon, the history of Iran's involvement with killing Americans. So one of my legacies is create an organization that can advance the goals of a Reagan party and get the best of Trump. The reason nobody's talking about this is that the political space on foreign policy is pretty narrow. People are so tired of the Mideast. Well, here's what's happened. Americans are disgusted. They're sick to their stomach. Their heart's broken. We have a moment here to rebrand Iran. I'm going to rebrand them for the ghoulish thugs and religious Nazis they are. We have a chance to up our game with the Arab allies. I want to help you, but if you don't meet the President of the United States when he goes to the region, you're making a huge mistake. I want to drive peace between Saudi and Israel as the ultimate blow to the Iranian hopes and dreams. So we got to do two things at once: wage war and seek peace. Polaris, this group, you're great allies, and we're on the right side of history. Unfortunately, history tells us that evil gets so strong that by the time we engage it, a lot of people die unnecessarily. That's happening right now today. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.